Okay, so let's start with a little housekeeping. So one involved this mentorship program that we talked a little bit about yesterday during the brown bag. And this mentorship program was really an opportunity. One of the things we recognized is there's always this gaping chasm that happens between graduate school or even regular school, right, undergrad, and job opportunities, as well as just plain old advice from people who are actively involved in doing the work you plan on doing one of these days. You get advice from your professors, but sometimes the professors haven't practiced in industry, or sometimes they're practicing in another particular industry that's somewhat different than yours. So we thought, well, we got all these smart people out there doing this every single day. Why wouldn't we enlist their help? And that's exactly what we've done. So I think we may have a group of about 40 mentors from around the country. Most of them, or a majority of, most, are here in the Valley, but some of them are around the country, and they're from companies like Intel and GoDaddy, PayPal, Target, let's see, Mayo Clinic, United Healthcare, a lot of really great companies actually. And there might be some from Slack, Google, places like that. So the idea is they're doing this stuff day in and day out. So why wouldn't we pair you with one of those folks to sort of serve as kind of your mentor through graduate school? And then they can tell you that, well, okay, here's what was helpful during graduate school, but that wasn't necessarily that helpful in industry. And here's what I really wish I had learned in graduate school that is helpful during industry. And here are the ways I've gone about getting jobs. And here are the opportunities I've taken in terms of internships, etc. And I think it's just really helpful. One of the ways that I've found it to be helpful, General Dynamics is another group we have. One of the ways I found it to be helpful is I left industry just about at the advent of agile development practices. So we still followed this sort of waterfall method that you learned about before. And in fact, human factors and user experience really introduced this notion of sort of planful iteration, which eventually became agile and so forth. These things were really happening at the same time. But so as a result, I can tell you all kinds of things about industries, about my days in industry. And most of them still hold, except when we get to the agile part. And then I have a difficult time. Well, that's not true of Dean Barker or Chad Phipps at General Dynamics, or these guys are doing this day in and day out. They're dealing with what's working well, what's a real hassle. If they had to do it over again, what would they do? And these are just great things for you to know about. So the idea behind the mentorship program is you would get signed. If you opt in, you need to opt in by going to this link that was sent to you by Bryant Foster. If it's not working on your phone for some reason, in fact, if you run into any problem, please send a note to Bryant because he'll be very keen to fix it. He wants this thing to, this is kind of his contribution to his alma mater. And the idea is you need to opt in, and then people will assign, it's really done by random, at least last time I checked, mentors to you. The nice part is this is done every semester. So you'll have one mentor this semester and another mentor next semester, and it doesn't mean that your first mentor ever goes away. You have their email, you've started a relationship with them, but hopefully by the end of your master's program you could have a good 4 mentors, maybe in different industries even. So that's kind of the idea. It's incumbent on you to contact them, however, simply because they'll end up being busy folks and so forth. We don't want them to have to track you down. But if you're assigned a mentor after you've opted in, please do contact them because they'll be very interested in hearing from you. So that's the idea behind the mentorship program. So I should ask, who did not receive this email? Oh my, what? This is crazy. Okay, hold on. If you did not receive this email, would you please write your email on this sheet of paper I'm passing around without looking through all my other personal, highly personal notes? You never know what could be on this pad. So would you pass that around? And if you don't mind, jot down your name as well as your email. And so I should mention, if you are not on this list, that is not by design. It's chances are it looks like it's new folks that are not on the list yet. So that's probably what's happened. So David's new, Annika's new, etc. Okay, so any questions about the mentorship program? Generally, these people are cool. So I would give them a call and check in with them, or contact them by email and check in with them. Okay, so we are going to continue. We're getting to a point, we're about to make a transition. I'm going in the wrong way. We're about to make a transition from the introduction to more sort of substantial and technical information. The substantial and technical information will start with sensation and perception. So those will be the things that include how do we see, how do we hear, how do we design things that are seeable and hearable and touchable and all of those kinds of things. But in the meantime, I wanted to still give you just a little bit more of the philosophy. Partially because I like the philosophy part of it, but it's also what you end up coming back to. So each one of your products that you work on, there will be some challenge that comes up that you'll have to go off and fix, and that might include a sensation and perception component, or it might include a cognitive component, or whatever. The philosophy part underlies everything, though, so that's why I want to make sure there's not a project where this stuff doesn't come into account. So the basis of this, if we go back to just sort of evolutionary biology, is we've been around, say, 300,000 years as Homo sapiens. That is, our brain structure is pretty much the same as it is now. It's just that our culture and our tools weren't the same as they are now. So I think I mentioned before, if you were an incredibly fast runner, you might be able to, and you ran for an hour, you might be able to cover, oh, I don't know, let's say 8 miles, right? You'd be moving along, right? So let's see, 5 miles per hour would be, well, you'd cover 5 miles. So that would be 12-minute miles. But imagine you're running 8 minutes through grass and hills and things like that. If you're a pretty good runner, that's not bad. Nowadays, we can move at 1,000 miles an hour. I mean, if you're talking about some aircraft, for example, we can move at 1,000 miles per hour. If we're driving down the street or driving down the highway, the speed limit is 75, but I was going 75 today, and people were zipping past me. So people are going 80, 90 miles per hour. Yet, for 300,000 years of our background, we never went much faster than about 5 or 6 miles per hour. And then we stopped because we got really tired and really winded. And then we, might trot or we would walk. So those things are really different. We didn't have things zipping past us left and right and so forth. The same thing with just our auditory environment. Again, let's think about driving. You drive past and you can hear everybody's radios and bass going and all those kinds of things. Those didn't happen to us in our evolutionary environment. In our evolutionary environment, if we heard something that wasn't a friend, we paid attention. And because there were good reasons that we wanted to stay alive, or maybe it could be food for us. So this way that we've developed this brain is really at odds with how our culture is now. On the other hand, our culture now has a lot of good things going for it. So for example, very few babies die in infancy these days, right? Our average lifespan has increased drastically. The ability, people don't die from the flu anymore, usually. I mean, it's very rare to die from the flu. Those kinds of things, there's a lot of great developments, but there's some things that come along with it. Things like anxiety that we wouldn't have necessarily experienced probably when we were hunter-gatherers. There would be some anxiety, but it would be a little bit more episodic rather than, or acute rather than chronic. Now, one of the things that happens is there's so much going on, and we worry about so many things, and we got so many to-do items, and we hear things all the time that we tend to be at a little bit more constant rate of sort of stress. And it's one of the reasons, probably anyway, that sort of chronic anxiety and depression and things like that exist, is there's a big mismatch between how we developed in our current world. I don't want to go back to hunter-gatherer tribes, by the way. I don't think I would be very good at it. But I think there's components of it we could borrow from. So here's the idea. If you think about evolution, we don't evolve necessarily, well, there's sort of vestigial components to evolution. In other words, we take what already existed and kind of build on top of it in order to accommodate our current situation. So if we had a brain that was really good for one thing for a while, and then it needs to become good for something else, well, we don't get rid of the old brain and start from the beginning. No, we add little components on top of it that just happen to get selected for. And so that makes a lot of sense for our way of thinking. There's a lot of things that are left over from even before we were humans that end up kind of affecting us now, and we'll learn about those as we go along. So if you look at this, our human genome is 98.5% identical to a chimpanzee's. I don't know why I have an apostrophe up there. That's weird. So I try not to make those mistakes, and they bother me a lot when I do. So to a chimpanzee's, we evolved in the context of creatures, at least originally, who didn't have language, right? They had grunts and pointing and things like this. But this is one of the problems with things like, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but with things like language interfaces on appliances. So for example, we say, well, language is really, it's really natural, right? We should just be talking to our machines. And sometimes that's the case. But I had some colleagues at, I think it was Whirlpool or GE Appliance or somebody like that, that said a few years ago, you know what, we're just going to have all of the interface, you talk to the stove. And when you talk to the stove, you say, set oven at 350 degrees, and you say cancel when you say, and you talk to your fridge, and you talk to all these things. And it turns out one of the things they learned was people weren't using it. And one of the reasons was it's so easy to just put a hand out and press a button or turn a knob or something like that, that they just didn't find themselves using it. They had to remember what the words were they were using. There might have been noise in the background. There were just all kinds of things. And we thought this new technology, speech recognition, would be great, but it turned out for that particular application it wasn't ideal. So one of the reasons, things like pointing, etc., picking things up, evolved well before language ever did. So that's the idea. This is also Herb Simon. He came up with this notion of satisficing. In other words, in fact, his Nobel Prize work was based on this. We don't tend to optimize our decisions. We tend to sort of satisfy our decisions. So for example, he wondered why the stock market was so weird. If you just took a utilitarian approach to the stock market, we should always want to sort of increase our gains to get the absolute most we could get out of our gains, and then sort of immunize ourselves from loss. And one of the things he recognized is that's not how traders did things. They would get to a point where if they were actually doing well, that was good enough. They wouldn't spend the extra time to sort of optimize their portfolios. They would sort of focus on, okay, I'm satisfied, I'm good. I'm going in the right direction, this is good. And one of the reasons is because it takes a whole lot of effort to actually optimize. We have computers optimized for us because there's so much computation involved in entertaining multiple situations and so forth. Our working memory isn't great for optimizing because our working memory is sort of, limited. So that's, nature doesn't tend to optimize, it satisfices. If it helps you sort of live longer and have more offspring, And those offspring also survive to have children, and so on, then it's selected for. Okay. So that's what I mean by new systems on top of old. So here's the notion. Remember, I was talking about Shakespeare's approach to this and then Gary Marcus's approach to this. Gary is a neuroscientist. Shakespeare, of course, was a writer. And it was really what Gary came up with was, you know, the brain is kind of a kludge. And what he means by a kludge is it's kind of an effective solution to a problem, but it's not the perfect solution to a problem. If we had perfect brains, they might do very different things, right? We might be able to calculate a whole lot of numbers faster. You might be able to read faster. There's all kinds of things a sort of more perfect brain would do. But in the past, we haven't been required to do those things in order to pass on our genes, so it hasn't been selected for. So as a result, we have a brain that really is sort of best suited for a different environment. So our job as designers is to understand the capabilities and limitations of that brain and to make sure that gets accommodated in your design. So, yeah, we have to design basically for a very kludgy creature. Let's see. So here's the thing about if you don't do human factors right, some really nasty things can happen. Robert Wright had a good example of that, or a good discussion of that. So it starts, let's just think about some of the commercial aspects of it. You have decreased willingness to buy. If something looks difficult to use, or if it is difficult to use, or if you've heard that it's difficult to use, you're less likely to buy it. So for example, I was just complaining, as I'm wont to do, about Camtasia here. And Joe just told me about Screencast. Screencast? ScreenFlow. As a result, I'm going to go check out ScreenFlow because I'm fed up with Camtasia because it's harder to use. So that was pretty innocuous enough, but these guys just potentially lost a customer. So that's what we mean by sort of decreased or poor word of mouth. Poor product reviews, I'd gathered these data a long time ago, but now huge components of both review sites as well as review magazines and trade magazines and so forth are dedicated to reviewing the usability of products. And if you don't come out on the positive end of that, then you're going to be losing money and reputation. So the other part is lost productivity. So for example, does anybody work in an organization where they design software or a product for that organization? Okay, a couple people. So imagine you're designing products for that organization. I had one project like this, or one group like this that I worked with for a long time called Quest. So Quest is it's called US West at the time, but it's Quest Communications. And the issue was the software that we were designing for people to use within the company was so difficult to use that it took forever to train people up. It took them a long time to do each transaction, and it just cost a lot of money for the company. So we went in and we were able to, just with some pretty simple changes, they had a call, I'll give you a background, they had a call center. And the call center was when people were out sort of what they call dispatching or turning on people's Quest service, their communication service and things like that. Sometimes they had difficulty. So they would call the call center, and they had sort of these really well-trained technicians who would walk through it on the phone. But the really well-trained technicians needed access to a bunch of data that were on screens on their computer. But it wasn't well arranged. So through our work, both research and design, and prototyping along the way, we were able to save them on average something like 2.7 seconds per screen. So that doesn't seem like very much, but you can save 2.7 seconds per screen on all kinds of products easily. 2.7 seconds wasn't a big deal. However, they had a call center of 100 people, and they might traverse, I forgot what the numbers were, but they might actually see something like oh, I don't know, 1,100 screens in a day. So whatever that amount ends up being, times this was a number of years ago, times their hourly rate, let's say fully loaded, including all of their healthcare and all that kind of stuff. Let's imagine it was something like $40 an hour, say. It was probably more because they were really well-trained folks, but say $40 an hour. It ended up saving millions of dollars in a very brief period of time for Quest, simply because of the math. You got 100 people, they're doing 2,700 screens or 17, I forgot how many, and we save them 2.7 seconds. That's a lot of money we just saved them. In addition, we were able to sort of improve their reputation, all of those kinds of things. When I first noticed there was a problem, I did observational research, and I sat down with this really wonderful tech. She was hilarious. And I just watched her and listened to her and so forth. And people would call her, and then she'd say, hey, how you doing? And talk for a minute. And the person would tell them what was wrong, and she would type it into the computer screen. And then she'd hit enter. And then a little spinny thing would go on for a while. And then she'd look at it on a printed out sheet of paper. And then she'd say, hey, did I tell you one about the priest and the rabbi and the, who knows what, the race car driver? So basically she had a list of jokes to tell the person on the other end of the phone because it took so long to do the query. And that was her way of making the time pass. So obviously we had a problem. So it's a kind of thing that you only get from observing people. And when they're trying to decide whether to continue to go with this project, which cost some money up front, I ended up telling their senior VP this story. And he's going, yeah, we can't, that's bad. and they ended up signing off on the project, and that ended up saving them a bunch of money. So it's amazing the places where you can find these dollars simply by understanding process, understanding people, and so forth. And some of them are pretty easy to do. So the other problem with poor human factors are just the increased maintenance costs. So you roll out a product, and that's great, right? You think you have all of the expensive stuff done. But now you have to keep going back and making changes because customers aren't happy with it. Customers, it breaks something they used to do. All of those kinds of things. About 80% of the cost of new product development is actually in maintaining the product after you've delivered it. And you hardly ever budget for that. So let's imagine you just signed up to do a software project that was going to cost $5 million. Great. You get the project done. Imagine you come in under budget. It cost a little less than $5 million. That's wonderful. You're a hero. And now it goes out. Well, you should probably count on another $4 million just in maintenance. If you don't have that budgeted, that means you're going to your boss and asking for $4 million that they didn't budget, and so on and so on. But with decent human factors and good design processes, you really reduce those maintenance costs. And I'll talk to you about some of those.
Have you ever been asked to do the exact opposite, where you would disimprove human factors? In retail, where returns cost, the retailer a lot of money,
yep.
They intentionally make the process difficult.
Right.
Or they just naturally come about that on their own? I
think they may naturally come about that on their own. There's one that I didn't work with. But I had some students who came to me afterwards up at Northwestern, and they worked for a company called GT Technologies, something like that. And they made slot machines and things like that for Vegas. And in their case, they were trying to get people to spend more time in the actual casino. And they wanted to, figure out ways to do that. That's probably the closest I've come. Yeah, that's a good question. But certainly these could operate in the opposite direction. I prefer them operating in this direction. Yeah. Yep. Somebody else had a question? Okay. So I think that maybe this graphic will help. So here's the way I like to think about these returns. Actually, that's not the way. This is the way I like to think about these returns. So if you think about product development, sort of in the beginning of a project lifecycle, imagine like you're just getting started before you've really done anything. The number of alternatives that you can entertain is really huge, almost unlimited. You can entertain all kinds of possibilities. And imagine you change and decide, oh, I'm not going to go with possibility A, I'm going to go with possibility B. It doesn't cost you much at all because you don't have anything laid out, right? On the other hand, as time goes on and you start developing more and more and putting more and more work into it and sort of painting yourself into a corner in design, right? Decisions are made for you or you're making decisions. The number of alternatives go down. And the cost of making any change goes way up because there's all these dependencies. So this is my main reason, and I hope that it's yours, for convincing people to get human factors and design and UX in general involved really early in the design of the products. Because that's where you can make the biggest change, that's where you'll get the least pushback, etc. It's also the case, I find, that if you're involved early, you have the best chance to be the main person doing the prototyping. And one of the things I've learned over time is if you own the prototype, if the prototype's on your computer, if you know it better than anybody else, if you can make changes better than anyone else, you wield tremendous power in that organization. I don't mean, parlor, I'm going to do bad things, but the fact is what you say is likely to get implemented. Because the prototype almost becomes the document of record. There will be another document like a product specification, for example, but that takes a back seat even to the prototype. Because people, when they start seeing the prototype, they think of that as the product. So when you can get in here early and start prototyping things early, then you're able to do what you need to do with the product, which hopefully is taking care of the user. So here's what we need, guys. If we're going to do this right, we need a few things. We need accurate information about our customers, their characteristics, their tasks, and their requirements. So we need to know what our customers need, frankly. And we can't leave that up to chance. We need some ways to not only generate design alternatives, but to be able to evaluate them. And we need some ways for identifying missed functionality and other problems. And we need to be able to do this pretty early in the design process. Usually that leads to another slide that tells you exactly how to do that. I will tell you how to do that shortly. Sorry. Yeah, you saw that. That's good enough. There are some other problems with bad human factors. These are old data, but bad human factors can also lead to increased litigation and liability. So litigation means just plain old lawsuits. Who's familiar with Exponent? So several people are familiar with Exponent. I really like this company. I've got former students who are there and so forth. And one of their specialties, they've got a couple now, but one of their specialties is doing legal consulting. And basically what ends up happening is people bring lawsuits against a manufacturer. They bring lawsuits against a customer. And Exponent goes through and does, I think I talked about this before, sort of accident reconstruction. They'll go through and offer their professional opinion as various kinds of engineers, but also human factors engineers. And basically try to find out, boy, does this person really have a case or not, based on what we know about the brain, based on what we know about mind, based on what we know about human behavior, and based on what the facts tell us about, or the evidence tells us about the accident. And then they provide that information. And they'll work on both sides. So they'll work on the plaintiff side and the defendant side, but their job is to try and find out the truth, basically, about this. And whoever hired them, it's important that they know the truth. Because let's imagine the company you're representing is in the wrong. well, they should know they're in the wrong, and then they can sort of plan accordingly. On the other hand, if they're in the right, that is, boy, that person did a thing that they really shouldn't have done. I've seen some good ones, actually. Then they know that they've got a good case, and let's not, sort of let them get away with it. So it's pretty interesting stuff. So this litigation is huge. And when you're in lawsuits, it does a number of things. It takes your eye off the ball. Your regular old product development, now you're worried about law stuff. And it also hurts your brand at times. If you're involved in lots of lawsuits, especially if people learn about them, or it becomes news, then it's really bad for your brand, which also costs money. So here's another example. It leads to just plain old human tragedy if you don't do things right. So the data I have up here are old. I'll try to use the new data instead. So in 1999 to 2000, the Institute of Medicine, which is basically the medical counterpart to the National Academies of Sciences. So they're kind of prestigious scientists. These guys are prestigious physicians around the country. Got together and decided they wanted to look at preventable hospital deaths annually. So people dying when they probably shouldn't have died when they were in the hospital. What's the frequency of this? What are the causes of them, and so forth? And their initial analysis indicated that between 44 and 98,000 people die preventably in hospitals in the US every year. So the way they described this was that was like a wide-body jet crashing almost every day in the United States. That's the number of people who died. That's ridiculous. If if a wide-body jet fell out of the sky every day, we would stop flying and we would be up in arms and demanding some improvements. But because these people die one here and one there and one there and one there, people don't aggregate them and put them together and recognize how bad this is. That was really problematic. It led to a number of things, including a focus on human factors in healthcare that's continued until this day. Before this, human factors was not involved in healthcare much at all. Now you see incredible opportunities for human factors people in healthcare. So even the low estimate at 44,000 would be the 8th leading cause of death in the US, more than AIDS, breast cancer, traffic accidents, and so on. In 2015, an article in the Journal of Patient Safety did a reanalysis and additional data and estimated that it's actually more like 251,000 people die in the United States every year due to preventable medical errors. Not just in the hospital, but elsewhere. So that would be a lot like, well, 240, I mean, it would be similar to quadrupling these numbers, tripling to quadrupling these numbers. So just a ridiculous number of people. It would be the second biggest cause of death in the United States every year. I think heart disease is the top. That's a real problem. So that's what I mean by tragedy. We got 251,000 people. Imagine it was only half that number of people dying when they don't need to die. That's tragic. It's especially tragic if they're one of your family members or you. So that's a problem.
I have a question about those numbers.
Yes.
So is that just directly from let's say, I don't know, like a machine kind of goes down, or can that be indirect, like maybe a computer system goes down in which a machine heavily relies on that? So is it direct and indirect?
It's
deaths, or just direct?
It's direct and indirect, is my guess. So I'm pretty sure it's direct and indirect, but I can tell you some other things about it. There's a number of reasons this might happen. People in the hospital, for example, are sick to begin with, often, right? So something that would have less effect on us when we're doing really well and out and about and working and so forth might have a very significant effect on somebody who's already sick or has a poor immune system or any number of other things, aren't breathing correctly and so on. So that's one of the issues. Sometimes it's things like we mix up the medications that we're supposed to give them. We've got a study, one of my students, well, in fact, Rogov's working on a study right now that looks at what we call look-alike, sound-alike medications. So look-alike, sound-alike medications would be something like, oh, there's Oxycontin versus oxycodone. Turns out one is kind of a long-term release kind of medication, the other one is short-term release. But there's a million medications that look alike or sound alike, and people have a tendency, including nurses and pharmacy techs and folks like this, have a tendency to confuse them from time to time, and people end up dying. There's the notion of death by decimal point with infusion pumps. So in infusion pumps, it's supposed to give you a certain amount of medicine per time unit. Imagine you're supposed to take 0.1 milligrams per milliliter over a certain period of time, and instead you hit 1 milligram per milliliter over a certain amount of time. That's called death by decimal point, and that can happen, and it has happened a lot in the past.
Same thing with death by decimal with radiation treatment.
And radiation treatment, absolutely. Absolutely, yep. So all of those kinds of things. Leaving sponges inside people during surgery is a common one. You wouldn't think it is, but so I spent a whole bunch of time. I took a sabbatical a few years ago and spent all my days almost in surgery at Mayo Clinic, just observing and doing other kinds of research. And it was always interesting to see people say, okay, let's do our count now. And actually it was usually a surgical tech and the nurse would grab each sponge and say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they would double check just to make sure they didn't leave any sponges inside the patient. There are instruments left inside the patient sometimes. There are times when we operate on the wrong leg, for example. There are times when we operate on the wrong patient. And these are just normal, these aren't bad doctors or bad nurses or anything of that. And if you're sick, I still encourage you to go to the hospital. However, there are improvements that we can make. So, yeah, so you'll notice them doing all kinds of things these days. So for example, if they're having your knee replaced, the person who preps you, usually one of the nurses or one of the techs, will write on you, I forgot what they write, but something like an R for right knee. And that way you make sure you operate on the right knee. Very simple kinds of things. Let me give you some examples here. I'm sorry, I don't mean to scare you guys with this, but it's important. So here's an example. Robin Rogers, it's a little bit older example. So she was vomiting and losing weight because she was pregnant at the time. She was 35 weeks pregnant and was vomiting and losing weight. And you know, about that time and the baby's coming and so forth, you want to be really careful. You want to be conservative with people. So they had her come in and get hospitalized and just go through kind of bed rest at the hospital. And they also ordered that she be fed through a tube, basically, until the baby came along. So she wasn't supposed to eat. Chances are she might have had a ventilator in or something of that sort. The problem was that the hospital mixed up 2 tubes. She had lots of tubes, of course, because that's what happens in the hospital. She mixed up two tubes. So instead of a tube that was snaked through her nose and into her stomach to get food, the nurse coupled the liquid food bag to a tube that entered a vein. So what was supposed to go into her nose and eventually into her stomach went directly into her vein. And this is a lot like pouring concrete down a drain. And unfortunately, she and her baby died as a result of this. This is actually a somewhat common problem where, because these tubes are kind of manufactured to be as cheap and interoperable, interchangeable, thank you, interchangeable as possible, there's some downsides. The beautiful part is they're cheap, they're easy to make, all those kinds of things. The downside is they're confusable. And in this case, they confused, the nurse or whoever it was got confused. Okay, so if you and I were to fix this problem, so this never happened again, what would we do?
Change identification, maybe change the tube size, make it to where it only one type of fitting or bag or device fits or meets or fits only that design.
Yep, I think that's a great one. So what Joe is talking about, sometimes we call it a lockout. There are other terms for it too. A forcing function is often for the engineering folks. But it's basically saying, imagine that you had two different tube sizes, so one couldn't get paired with the other, right? That would be a great way of doing things. And I agree. Are there any others? You could color code them, for example. And color coding is a great one. The only tricky part with that is, at least half of the time, the room's dark because you want the person sleeping as much as possible. So colors are a little harder to discriminate during that period. But that's a good one.
Careful with people who are colorblind.
And you have to worry about people who are colorblind. About 9% of the male adults, well, males are colorblind. Yep.
You could place an RFID tag on the medication, then the machine would not accept it.
Yep. So that's another possibility. You could use some more technological approaches, which people have been doing lately, and have gotten ridiculously cheap, and use something like that so that it sort of warns them, hey, these two things don't go together.
Why didn't she, but it's kind of confusing where it says they coupled the liquid food bag to a tube to enter the vein. Where was the vein tube located? It just seems like the locations might have been too similar.
Right. So the source actually might be too similar. It's true that the location of entry to the body was here and here, say, right? This for the vein and this for the nose.
Yeah.
But if they're both hanging on the same,
Okay.
which is
Couple
possible,
them
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So some other things we could, so we talked about color, good one. Talked about lockouts, good one. We talked about RFID. Any others?
Scheduling. Only feed and don't administer medication.
Yep.
Or administer medication at a different time than feeding.
So procedural, basically. Yep. Any others? Yep.
You could maybe add textures to the tubing so you can kind of feel it almost too. So when it is dark, you can kind of feel it.
Yep. And I've always been a big fan of that one, adding textures, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is actually all of these help us discriminate one from the other. The only downside about the lockouts is it keeps me from doing the thing I'm not supposed to do. But it doesn't necessarily guide me to do the thing I should do. Color coding helps in that regard. Texture would help in that regard, etc. So often what I'm looking for is redundancy. I'm looking for two ways, at least, to communicate this information. So the idea is to borrow some knowledge that people in aviation, for example, and other kind of high reliability organizations have known for a long time, which is, for God's sake, don't have just one point of failure. Basically enable, if that one thing fails, have 2 or 3 backups that enables you to stay in the sky, for example, and make it to where you need to get to or make it to the closest airport. The same thing with humans, basically. If they can make one kind of mistake, well, reduce the likelihood of that by having additional ways of reducing the likelihood of that mistake. So redundancy is a really key component of human factors. So she did die, unfortunately. The issue is that a lot of patients have many clear plastic tubes. They deliver all kinds of things. The tubing's often interchangeable. And the nurses connect a whole bunch of these every day. So the issue is, even if the nurse is like 99.5% perfect with this kind of work, that means every once in a while there's going to be an accident, basically. And this is the thing that you have to remember about accidents or errors. They can be very low frequency, but high consequence. So for her, of course, for Robin, it was a tremendous consequence, even though that nurse may have never have done that ever before in his or her life. So, yeah, and a simple misconnection can lead to death. Sometimes tubes are intended to inflate blood pressure cuffs, but they get connected to IV lines and you get an embolism. IV fluids get connected to tubes intended to deliver oxygen, leading to things like suffocation and so forth. Here's another one, and this, one of my favorite books on human factors is called The Human Factor. And he talks about this one. The vincristine errors, these are called, and most of the ones he talks about are in Canada because he's a professor up in Canada. But this kid, Ryan Bishop, was diagnosed with leukemia, and he was treated with chemotherapy for 3 years, and after 3 years he was doing really well, actually, and he was going to receive his second to last treatment. So his leukemia had been in remission for 2 years, but they're like, let's not take any chances with this leukemia. Let's keep hitting him hard with this chemotherapy for a while, just to be on the safe side. So he got his second to last dose, and on the way home he began to feel ill, and the next day he felt worse. He had been given this medication that's common, actually, called vincristine, and it's a drug commonly used for childhood leukemia. The thing about vincristine is it should only be given intravenously, that is, into the veins, right? They also gave him a medicine common as well called methotrexate at the same time, but this medication has to be given intrathecally, and what that means is sort of by spinal injection. If you give vincristine intrathecally, then it has a tendency to destroy the nervous system. Well, sure enough, they mistakenly gave both drugs intrathecally instead of intravenously, and Ryan died at 8 years old. They got a sort of blue ribbon task force together and came up with some of the suggestions Joe mentioned. So for example, they said things like not only should drug packages be clearly labeled and color-coded for intravenous versus intrathecal, smart idea, color coding, somebody mentioned that. The syringes should be labeled so that they're different for different doses or different medications. They should never be located in the same room at the same time. That's kind of the process approach. And they wanted to make sure they publicized this publicly around Thunder Bay and other places.
More recently, IT has been phased out of usage.
Yep.
In most medical situations, that abbreviation.
Partially because of that, or yep.
Absolutely because of that.
Yep. So, and that's not one we would have thought of, which is let's just get rid of this way of administration pretty much altogether.
Not administration, but abbreviation on the drug. You
Oh, okay.
Administered IT, you'd say it's with the whole intrathecal.
Yep.
Or you would say, you just don't use it. It's completely discouraged in charting and everything else.
Yep.
What do they call it instead?
Use it by the whole name. You don't. IV and IT is easy to confuse, so you use intrathecal.
Oh, okay, got it. Now I gotcha. Yep, and that's sort of related to this look-alike, sound-alike medication error. This is a look-alike, sound-alike sort of way of administering. Yep. Good to know. Thanks. These things continued to happen over this period of time. So another kid, 2 years old, Courtney, from Nova Scotia, went through the same thing, treated with vincristine and methotrexate. After 2 years, her cancer went into remission. As she was receiving her last treatment, her doctor was busy that day, so another doctor filled in, which happens all the time, of course. And that doctor mistakenly gave both drugs by IT, or intrathecally. She died 2 days later at 4 years old. She was cured of the leukemia, but died from that. And happened with another child. It happened a bunch of times. Basically the same kind of error happening over and over again. So I'll go back here for a minute. I think the thing, as people got debriefed and frankly litigation occurred and all of these kinds of things, you got the sense from the healthcare providers that of course they weren't doing these things on purpose. They had no particular interest in killing children or moms. They often, in fact, had very good sort of meaning. That is, this person just had a lumbar puncture, for example. Do we really want to, and it's a baby more or less, do we really want to stick them again with an IV? We've got a perfectly good, access going through the spine. Why not just administer it that way? And especially with children, because their veins are not easy to sort of identify and so forth. chubby babies, right? So they're kind of hard to get to these veins. So they often thought they were doing the right thing, maybe even going above and beyond the call of duty by doing things differently. But they made a mistake. Another example of this is, so is anybody familiar with Dennis Quaid, the actor? He and his wife had twins. And the twins were born prematurely. So like a lot of premature kids, they went into the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU it's called. And in almost all cases, when people go to the hospital, they will provide venous access. So they'll basically give you, they'll insert a needle in your arm usually, and basically have access in case you need to be delivered fluids or medication quickly. And that's just a good thing to do. But if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that that little area doesn't clot, right? So a clot is kind of, well, it's a really good thing for most people if they're bleeding, but it can obstruct that fluid getting in there. So they use a medication called heparin. So heparin is really good. It's an anticoagulant. It lets all the blood flow through and so forth. So they were born in 2007. And unfortunately, they were given 2 adult doses of heparin. That is, they got 1,000 times stronger dose than what they would have been given. So the nurse failed to detect, actually it was the pharmacy tech more than anybody else, failed to detect the dosage on the bottle. So here are the 2 bottles. Here's what they should have been given. This thing here, that is 10 universal units basically per milliliter. And what they got was 10,000 units per milliliter. So this turned their blood into the consistency of water, basically, and they started bleeding spontaneously. And eventually they figured it out, thankfully, and were able to, I don't know if they gave them a coagulant of some kind, I doubt it. You might know more than I do about that, David. But what they did do is they stopped administering this adult dose of heparin, and the kids recovered, and they're actually doing quite well now. But there were a bunch of other cases where kids didn't recover. So there was an episode where 5 or 6 people in Dallas, babies, died because of this error. And another one in, I think, Indianapolis, where a bunch of kids died because of this error. How did this error happen?
Sorry, I was just looking up real quick.
Good, thanks.
One thing to know is that with anesthesia and other drugs,
Yep.
you want to ask if there's a reversal agent. So heparin
Right.
does have a reversal agent.
Good.
So they use a reversal agent.
What is that one called? Do you remember?
This one is protamine sulfate.
Okay. Does it like increase fibrinogen or?
Partially reversal. That might be
Okay.
something rabbit hole we don't want to go down.
Okay, but yeah, that's interesting. So in fact, I hadn't thought about the reversal agent until I was just talking a second ago. But yeah, so that's good. I mean, if you can detect it, you can reverse it. But often people would be wondering, why is this kid bleeding like this? Do they have hemophilia? Do they have, is there some other?
Twins in that case too, though, that both exhibit the same symptoms, so you would be more likely to assume a medical error.
Right. Yeah, and one was male, one was female, so hemophilia probably wouldn't have worked out very well. Anyway, interesting. Why did they make this mistake?
Stored in the same location.
They're stored in the same location. That's a good one.
Bottles look the same.
The bottles look
Pretty
awfully the same. I mean,
That's a result of the investigation. That didn't they both look identical almost?
they do. Yeah.
The names
So-
kind of look the same too.
The names are very similar. Even the dosages look the same. I mean, if you think about it, if you're looking at things, the difference is 2 zeros.
And probably 99% of the time you administer heparin or you dose out heparin because they're given to adults. You don't
Yep.
necessarily give heparin in NICU
Right.
unless you're trained that way.
Right.
It was probably just what he commonly gave out. He wanted to go to lunch.
But yeah,
So
it
it's an
hurried
order
along,
heparin, here's a bottle of heparin. I'm going to go.
which is normal human behavior.
I
Yep.
find it interesting that the text font size difference
Yep.
there is no difference in the second one, but there is one in the first one, and then that
Well, that's interesting.
that
Yep.
detail of similarity between
Yep.
the dosage actual from far away.
Yep. And I think it's probably just because these guys had to fit more words on this one. This says preservative-free, etc. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that that was by design to help them discriminate them, but I think they had to fit more information on one of them, and that's had something to do with that.
So do they use that to keep the tubes clean, or?
Yeah.
That's
Basically to keep the tubes open. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so here's another take on it, very similar to the things you guys described. And so imagine you were in brand. So this company is Baxter, out of Chicago area. And imagine that you were in charge of branding for Baxter. One of the things you would do is create brand standards, brand guidelines, and you'll experience this, you UX folks will certainly experience this over time, that describe, okay, here are the colors we're allowed to use, here are the fonts we're allowed to use, etc. And we do that so that our brand always looks the same. Nike swoosh, more or less, always looks the same in lots of different situations. Same with Pillsbury or Ford, the Ford symbol, etc. And there's only certain colors you're allowed to use. That's true of ASU, as a matter of fact. So if you're in branding, you want every single product not necessarily to look the same, but at least to have a family resemblance. And that's exactly what happened here to the branding people and the designers. Well, yeah, of course I can discriminate those two things between, if I have them side by side and I'm not doing anything else. But if I'm a busy pharmacy tech and I'm hurrying along and I load up the cabinet in the neonatal intensive care unit with this, and it's heparin, and it's all, the only thing in there that's related to heparin, a nurse may very well come along and say, oh, yep, this looks right, and use it.
Is that picture before or after the incident?
This is before the incident. These are the ones that were used, or the models that were used. They've since changed the, you can imagine, they've since changed the designs.
Do you have a picture of what they changed it to?
I don't, but it'd be nice if somebody doesn't mind looking around for that and bringing it for next class. That would be good.
I think the cap is red on the 10,000 USB.
Yeah, but again, these are minor things. Okay, so these problems happen and they're serious, I guess, is the point. The other problem with healthcare. So I'm talking about healthcare because of this notion of, I talked about sales and I talked about all those other things which are important. I'm talking about healthcare because I'm talking about sort of the human tragedy possibilities. Now there's human tragedy associated with flying and driving and everything else. I happen to be more familiar with this one. But a lot of these errors don't get reported. And it's simply because, people lose their jobs for reporting these things and so forth. So if you make a mistake, and then you recognize that mistake and you're able to fix it, it sort of doesn't feel like a mistake. So you sort of sweep it under the rug or don't think about it very much, right? Oh, good. Whew, that was a close call. I fixed that. But that means the next person doesn't necessarily get to hear about it and so forth. Whereas often in aviation these days, if there's a close call, you report that close call and it goes into a database and people make use of those data. And that exists now in healthcare. I don't think it's being used as well as it does in aviation.
And in healthcare also, when someone dies and they list the
Yep.
cause of death, they'll say, the baby's
Heart
dying of
attack.
sanguination
Yeah, absolutely.
instead of, tech error.
That's exactly
So
right.
The data's just not
Yep,
gathered
it's
correctly.
not great data. Yep. So I think that there's a few reasons for poor human factors. One, actually, I got this when I was at HP. One of my buddies there, and I'm sure he put it up for me, but had a bumper sticker that said, it was hard to design, it should be hard to use. And they were funny. Let's see. Sometimes there's not enough policy or just sort of emphasis from management. Basically, that stuff needs to be really easy to use. Now, this is changing a lot, which is why we have a full class, basically. Even a few years ago, we wouldn't have this many people because people weren't even aware that this existed or this was problematic. And because technology is hard to design, it turns out, and hard to make work and so forth, and I think that's important for us to remember. because of that, we put all our emphasis on the technology instead of the human. And that ends up causing all kinds of problems. We also make some unrealistic assumptions about people and what they can do, and especially what they can do when they're not paying attention or they have several things to pay attention to, when they're multitasking, things like that. So that's the idea. So I wanted just a moment to talk to you about careers in this field. Many of you are probably already gainfully employed in this career, and I'm happy to have you here. And I would like to see more and more people in this career because the work needs to be done. But I thought I would mention a few of the opportunities just in case. So in industry and business, there are opportunities for people who study human factors and user experiences, interaction designers, usability designers, UX designers, research scientists, and so forth in industry and business. In government, there's also huge opportunities for interaction designers, sort of the same folks. In consulting, there's usability, UI design, UX, management consulting, industrial design, litigation, and areas like that. In academics, you may choose to become a professor, for example. And you often become professors in the following departments, but there's more added all the time. So psychology, industrial engineering, design, marketing, computer science, cognitive science, management, places like that. Frankly, these days, medical schools, etc. And the idea here is you often, will go work in an industrial engineering department even though your degree is in psychology. And sometimes you'll work in kind of a more psychology-oriented program when your degree is in industrial engineering. So it's just a lot of sort of cross-fertilization that way, and that's how it should be. And then there's areas, if you think about the kind of experience you're getting, related to marketing that are pretty important. So for example, market research, when you guys are taking your stats and your experimental design and all of those kinds of things, that's exactly what market research people do all day long. And in many ways, I don't mind saying this, I think our training is better. Brand strategy, understanding people's opinions and how to influence them and so forth, goes with marketing. And then over time you end up managing whole products or programs, become a chief experience officer potentially, etc. So there's lots of opportunities out there for people who study what you want to do. Sometimes they're research oriented, sometimes they're design oriented, sometimes they're both. But in terms of opportunities, there's good ones. Here are just some of the examples of companies that have hired from around here recently. But I mean, this list, when I first created it, it was like every time we added somebody new, I was like, oh, that's exciting. We added somebody new. Now it's everybody. So I'm sure this could be, increased tenfold. And then HFES, Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, has a bunch of technical groups. So these are like specialty nerd groups who like to focus on certain parts of human factors. So here's the one, let's see, what's the one I'm most involved in? The one I'm most involved in these days is product design. But there's also another one, where's cognitive engineering and decision making. There's one just on aging, right? How do we design and so forth for an aging population, etc. But I think this is an interesting one to do. There's one on, where's our litigation or forensics? Forensics, as I was telling you about before. Healthcare is the other one. I'm not sure if I shared this with the other class, but I thought this would be useful for you to look at quick, and I'll try not to take up too much more of your time. But if you think about the stuff you need to know, I've sort of, and this is just a start, but I've sort of divided them into these 4 categories based on whether they're core or whether they're specialized and whether they're knowledge or whether they're actual skills. Now, skills is a type of knowledge, but I'm not going to make that distinction right now. So I would like all of you guys to know an awful lot about vision, hearing, touch, and vestibular senses. So basically how we figure out where we are in space. That's vestibular. And I would also like you to know, and you will, a lot about learning, memory, decision making, judgment, and situation awareness. So those are kind of the core things that I think it's critical that human factors and UX people know about. Then there's some specialized things. You may decide that, you know what, human-computer interaction is my thing. I really like that stuff. I'm going to go learn everything I can on it. You don't have to learn all of these. You just have to learn one or two. Teamwork is another one that might be interesting to you. Human error and accidents. That's one that Joe's focused on quite a bit, given his background. Transportation, human factors. A lot of the work that Rob does, for example. Sports, also Rob. How do we select the right people for jobs? Training and education. Folks like Scotty and Rod, for example, work in that area. And anthropometry and biomechanics, and I might just have this in italics because we don't do much of that here. Simply because our background, we're psychology, we didn't focus as much on the physical human factors. So this is not to suggest it's not important. It's critically important. It's so important you should learn it from somebody besides me. So that's kind of the idea. Then skills, the stuff everybody's going to need to know about is how do I design an experiment, how do I analyze the data, how do I do observational research and ethnographic research and get good stuff out of it instead of doing it like a hack. How do I do participatory design, that is, enlist people to help me design stuff? How do I do a good task analysis? So we'll learn about these things. I won't teach you much computer programming here, but some computer programming, I don't see him here, but I was talking to one of the students the other day. Some computer programming is helpful. What's that?
Roger's a master at it.
Is he? Good, good. And then skills on the specialized side, being able to design controls and displays, which is a lot like human factors or user interface design and so forth. The understanding of user interface standards, the product development process, all that kind of stuff. So I need to make sure that this is, well, hopefully the recording as well as the PowerPoints will be available for you on PowerPoint, on Blackboard. So please take a look at this so that you don't have to write furiously later on. I think I covered that. The way I think about it, and then that's it. I'm not going to talk about desire lines today. The way I like to think about it is the people who succeed in this stuff, user-centered design, tend to be these kinds of specialists with a collaborative approach. So somebody who's really good at one thing but is a really good communicator and has the right spirit to work on a team. And they come from all kinds of places, and you're just one of those. And the notion is when these guys get together, these folks get together, you get this effect, sometimes referred to as the Medici effect. And the Medici effect is if you bring all these people with different sort of experiences and backgrounds together, they begin to inform each other. And suddenly each other's sort of profession grows and their ability to do things grow. And they do more unique and interesting work. So, and we'll talk about, that should be the last one, desire lines tomorrow, but you can read about those. Or we will, not tomorrow, Tuesday. Any questions before we part ways? Good. Thank you, everybody. See you Tuesday.